There is no denying that slavery had a direct and positive tendency to produce coarseness and brutality in the treatment of animals, especially those most useful to agricultural industry. Not only the slave, but the horse, the ox, and the mule shared the general feeling of indifference to the right naturally engendered by the state of slavery. The master blamed the overseer the slave, and the slave the horses, oxen, and mules. And violence fell upon the animals as a consequence.
Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Yeah. So I've always gotten this question a lot. I've also gotten some correction from you guys, my good people. Your question is always, or rather your correction is always, don't call us black, don't call us Africans, don't call us African Americans, call us melanated people. That is how they say. Sometimes while doing videos, I talk about how black people went to USA, they went there through slavery, and I also get some comments, no, some of us didn't go there through slavery. Some of us went there long, long ago, even before Christopher Columbus, an African-American professor, gave out a speech, just like any other speech I've always shown you. She's giving a different perspective that I think you should learn. Columbus came to show the European world that he discovered a place. But the question is, how can you discover a land with the people inside? How can you say that? I think the right word he should have used is that Christopher Columbus met the Americas. He was walking and then he saw, oh, that's North America. He went south. Oh, that's South America. That's what he did. But discovering, no, you can't discover a land with the people inside. This professor is able to tell us that the black people we have in the United States of America, some of their descendants or some of their ancestors, which is the correct term here, did not go there through slavery. They migrated to there from Africa a very, very long time ago. And she also tells us that the concept of home is a multifaceted term, emphasizes its various meaning within the context of black queer studies. Home means different terms to different people. Sharon Harland, who is the professor, explores the intersection of African American studies, Native American studies, black feminist studies, and queer studies. From these, she's able to give a perspective of the black movement into the America before the slave trade and before Columbus. I think we need to watch this. After this, I shall share with you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis.
The animal looks at us, and we are naked before it. Thinking, perhaps, begins there. Jacques Derrida, the animal that therefore I am. Second epigraph. Where else but in this disorganized world would such an encounter be possible? Toni Morrison, A Mercy. First section, Nemesis. In the revised and expanded edition of the dreaded comparison, Human and Animal Slavery, originally published in 1988, and about which Alice Walker said, and I quote, "This powerful book will take a lifetime to forget." Not sure if that was really faint praise or not, but Marjorie Spiegel begins to bear a series of always awful and sometimes artful proofs about the relationship. Is this echoing a lot? It sounds echoey to me. You can hear me? Okay, just want to make sure. Sometimes artful proofs about the relationship between the suffering, think Bentham, 1789, think Levinas. At one point in her critique, Spiegel turns herself to the literary and Sterling L. Brown's 1968 essay, Negro Character as Seen by White Authors. While noting the post-emancipation shift in the attitude of whites toward their black counterparts, Brown uses the image of, quote, the docile mastiff turned rabid mad dog to draw readers' attention to the stereotyping of blackness as bestial. Spiegel then observes that, quote, in seeing comparisons of blacks to animals that were so prevalent in the period literature of his study, Brown accepted and, through his response, subsequently strengthened the negative views about animals held by racist authors. Brown's indignation at these offensive books blinded him to the fellow victims of their propaganda, end quote. Spiegel's assessment pulls in two directions. The first is more obvious, that stereotypes of animals are universally held. The second is more opaque, that blackness's normative gaze upon the animal therefore prohibits ethical relation. And in an encounter with the animal, enslaved experience can justify dropping the bottom out of the question of blackness's ethical commitment to the animal other, put another way. This is a fundamental problem to which I will return. In the course of her examination of animal and human suffering, and this is an important detail because no moment of comparison in the book opens the possibility of shared pleasure, only pain, she makes the obligatory nod toward the condition and sentiment of the Native American. Spiegel writes in a chapter on hunting, and I quote, "Notably, traditional culturally intact Native Americans and many other Aboriginal peoples hunted out of real necessity, with respect for and in harmony with the balance of nature. Theirs was not a profane act, nor an unconscious attempt to symbolically conquer chaos. Harmony and respect were central to an entire world view, a view of the universe with which the very lives of Native Americans were imbued, from birth until death, and in their philosophy, from death until rebirth." End quote. Now that's a mouthful. This type of conceptualization of Indian life is not uncommon, and Phil Deloria painstakingly documents how we as an American culture arrived at such overwhelming and overarching collective sentiment about Native Americans in his important book, Playing Indian. What I am interested in for the purposes of this talk and for the aims of my larger project called tentatively Perishment, Thoughts at the Interstice of the Human-Animal Distinction, is not how or why we arrived at our conclusions about blacks and Indians' relationship to the animal, but rather how we might think through these historicized entanglements. I say historicized because views of Indian life and animals are sedimented in a kind of archaic, to borrow from Deloria, historicization of an Indian time before settler colonialism. Views of black life and animals solidified during slavery, as Spiegel's book relentlessly catalogs. What is interesting about Spiegel's front-loading of negative black relation to the animal via Brown's work is that she ends her observations with several quotes in support of her comparative argument, end quote. The nagging question I have is why Spiegel doesn't use their work as evidentiary claim for her argument. Why front-load a lack of ethical connection when the literature might tell us otherwise? In the comparative framework I am drawing here, black relation to the animal is rendered as a blind spot, impossible because of the machinations of slavery. Indian relation to the animal is naturalized as part of a cultural matrix, universalized to the point of becoming the great Indian chain of being. To push this argument a little further, I do want to note that I am purposely picking on Spiegel, but my nudging is intentional here, as I believe there is something to be gained from thinking through this opposition between Indian and black, among Indian, black, and non-human animal. Years ago, I wrote an article about Afro-Native literature and the importance of thinking through issues of sovereignty and emancipation. I now pick up the loose thread of that argument in order to think through the relationship of these stereotypical views of black-Indian relation to the non-human animal. In the literature, at least, it seems as if freedom and self-determination are a task that Indian and black peoples are not up to accomplishing on their own. Moreover, I want to also note that this fitness for self-government is dependent upon, not upon the relations among humans per se, but mired in one's relationship to the non-human animal, making the present-day question of the animal absolutely important to the articulation of aspects of sovereignty and freedom constitutive of Indian and black life, respectively. Taking one more glance at Spiegel, in the same chapter on hunting, where she gives praise, specious though it might be, to Indian lifeways, she also states rather offhandedly, quote, "Hunters may pay up to $50,000 to legally kill an endangered polar bear in Canada, purchasing a hunting license from a Native American tribe that peddles them for cash," end quote. So much for the peace, love, and coconuts argument about Native culture, which ends the chapter. Here, the beautiful fiction of Indian essence comes smack in the face of the issue of sovereignty. When it comes time to self-determine, the indigenous body is a mere peddler, a black market capitalist, end quote. I mean, that's not end quote, I actually said that. So too, this is what happens when you're too proud to get those bifocals, you know. So too does black life falter in the wake of emancipation, as Spiegel quotes Brown's opinion that, in freedom, they are beasts, end quote. The twin images of the sovereign and the beast are brought to bear here in a stunning kaleidoscopic interplay. This arc resonates with my larger fourth book project, the Perishment Project, as I endeavor to expose a global conversation about sovereignty and biopower to intellectual work in Native studies that should inform it. For the purposes of today's lecture, I hope to understand this connection among Black, Indian, and non-human animal as it is drawn in Toni Morrison's A Mercy. How many readers here of A Mercy? Okay. A peculiar, pithy, but dense homage to relationships among peoples in the fledgling nation, circa 1690. But first, a bit on sovereignty and freedom. After the 1871 congressional decision to suspend treaty-making practices with indigenous peoples, the United States entered into a colonial power relationship with them, at least in the eyes of Kevin Brunel's The Third Space of Sovereignty. In the period between 1871 and the political movements of the 60s that brought forth moments like the American Indian Chicago Conference, this colonial relationship devolved, to put it mildly. Thinking through both Phil Delory and Brunel's arguments about the necessary mythic disappearance of the Indian into an archaic past, I am intrigued by how this naturalizing of Indian being through issues of non-sovereign rule can be understood alongside self-determination and emancipation, also as a node which returns the Indian and Black other to a deteriorating natural state, to a beast who cannot be governed by itself or others. In Jacques Derrida's famed first volume of his last series of lectures, The Beast and the Sovereign, he notes, and I quote here again, "Here, whenever we speak of the beast and the sovereign, we shall have in view an analogy between two current representations, current and therefore problematical, suspect to be interrogated. Between this type of animality or living being that is called the beast, or that is represented as bestiality, on the one hand, and on the other, a sovereignty that is most often represented as human or divine, in truth, anthropo-theological," end quote. Thus, the condition of sovereignty is weighted heavily in the direction of the non-human animal, or to echo Derrida, a type of animality, making ideas of animal being intrinsically bound to the ability of the sovereign to self-determine not only his or her own fate, but that of others. Derrida paints the landscape of interaction between beast and sovereign with the stuff of fairy tales, the big bad wolf, among others, demonstrating that the archaic, or the no longer efficient, is also in play during this scripted interaction. To solidify what I mean by this archaic past that I also mentioned earlier, I turn to Brunel's apt description of the catch-22 that Native peoples find themselves in relation to what he terms, and this is perhaps another mouthful, the modern American liberal democratic settler state. End quote. In Brunel's assessment of the Mille-Lacs Band's response to then Wisconsin Governor Jesse Ventura's challenge to Native sovereignty, he notes, and I quote, "There are two prevalent American sentiments about indigenous peoples' political status. The first sentiment is that indigenous tribes and nations claim a form of sovereignty that is unclear because it is not easily located inside or outside of the United States. The spatial logic is quite simple. If the tribe is part of the United States, it is not sovereign, but if it is to be sovereign, it cannot be part of and thus make demands on the United States. The second sentiment is that the treaty-secured rights of indigenous tribes stem from an archaic political time that cannot assume a modern form. In sum, Chippewa sovereignty is not permitted to develop into a modern form and engage in practices commiserate with present-day American political life," end quote. Assessments of what Black freedom at the time of emancipation and beyond would look like travel along the lines of the racist to the truly celebratory. While the state of Black persons in the U.S. is neither colonial nor post-colonial, this neither nor boundary, this inability for Blackness to settle into its progress, is reflective of the same states of injury and redress outlined by post-colonial theorists. In many ways, once formal campaigns to repatriate Blacks to Liberia, for example, ceased, the Black body, like its Indian counterpart circa 1871, was cast in a web of constant attempts at domestication. No longer what Brunel calls a foreign concern, Indianness, and I would add Blackness here as well, became a domestic problem to be solved through attempts at veritable eradication. But present life demonstrates the absolute failure of this effort to domesticate. I want to turn now to Morrison's A Mercy, to demonstrate ways in which this attempt to answer the question of Black freedom and Indian sovereignty, to how the novel clears the way for ways in which this attempt to answer the question of Black freedom and Indian sovereignty is managed by Morrison in the negative. I also want to draw our attention to how the novel clears the way for such domesticating through the figure of the non-human animal and human association with it. The next section is entitled Of Beasts and Sovereigns. I just realized I don't have the time. You have the time somewhere? 4:56. 4:56? Okay, thank you. We are a nation obsessed with origins. If one were to listen to the hue and cry from distant quarters of this country's Tea Party revolutionaries, we would think that our origins certainly do not reflect the diversity of persons who pepper this small portion of the globe we call home. And in Mercy, the notion of origin is always already that, a notion usually vague and unimpressive as a foundational idea of something. When we wish in our present tense for how things were, we reset the clock on the past, populate it with those whom we imagine, reflect our core values as a nation, and then repackage that thing called history for more popular consumption. Nothing is so black and white as our ideas about history when we get down to the business of hating one another. Anyone who wants to get back to that mythical and happy nation that our founding fathers authored hasn't had the pleasure of reading the tedious diary entries of Cotton and Increase Mather, or delighted in the musing of one Michael Withersworth, or contemplated Thomas Jefferson's more self-reflexive chapter called Manners, and Notes on the State of Virginia on the devastating havoc that centuries of slavery can wreak upon kin, home, and ultimately nation, or venture to read William Apis's stunning manifesto, or had a look at David Walker's appeal. When we start to have conversations about who belongs where and why, where and when and why, I am reminded that except for certain tender mercies like acts of friendship, salvation, and sustenance, none of us do belong. Diversity in this nation is not new. In fact, it is plainly put, a mercy. If a mercy can be understood to encompass all the acts between human beings that comprise the nature of diversity itself, in these times our very biodiversity is dependent upon a mercy. Acts of acknowledgement, kindness, and bravery pull human being from the arc of hatred and isolation into the bandwidth of compassion and consideration of the other. Those same acts, in turn, must also pull non-human animal being from the brink of extinction. A mercy, according to the OED, can be a blessing or a relief. In many ways, a mercy is an ethical commitment. In his brief essay on the name of the dog, or natural rights, there goes that dog again, right? From Difficult Freedom, Emmanuel Levinas observes, and I quote again, "With the appearance of the human, and this is my entire philosophy, there is something more than my life, and that is the life of the other," end quote. In the Cartesian tradition that Levinas follows, it is important that the animal is distinct from the human. For some philosophers, this difference is speech. For Levinas, it is the face. The face holds the possibility for recognition, for exchange, for mercy. Animals are thought to be incapable of such reciprocal looking, hence the beginning of the talk in Jacques Derrida's Standing Before the Animal, Naked, Gazing Upon You. In her astute review of the novel, that is, A Mercy, New York University scholar Elizabeth McHenry writes that the book is, quote, "a story about a world in which acts of mercy prove ambiguous, and the lines between cruelty and compassion are murky at best," end quote. Indeed, somewhere between the ambiguous and the murky, cruelty and compassion, the ethical commitment floats, awaiting our attention, our action. A Mercy, this is a really bad summary, so I apologize, but Morrison's, I wrote a much longer one, and then that was like 4 pages, so I thought, I'm just gonna give you the really bad Cliff Note version, and then we can talk a little bit more about, obviously, what's missing here. A Mercy tells the story of Florence, Lena, Sorrow, and Jacob and Rebecca Vark. On a small but steadily growing farm in Virginia, Jacob, an orphan himself, hailing from Amsterdam, acquires Florence and Sorrow, both abandoned and in need of a home. I will examine at some length a scene in the novel that describes how Florence comes to live on the Vark farm later. But the central action of the novel revolves around Florence's sexual obsession with and journey to find the blacksmith, who has knowledge of healing herbs that might bring Rebecca Vark back from the brink of a smallpox death. The opening of the novel is decidedly animal. Florence is the first character we meet, and in classic Morrison fashion, she comes to us out of the ether in the middle of recounting a difficult experience and enjoying our ability as readers to be shocked into the time of the novel. Morrison writes, "Don't be afraid. My telling can't hurt you in spite of what I have done. and I promise to lie quietly in the dark. I will never again unfold my limbs to rise up and bare teeth. I explain. You can think what I tell you a confession if you like, but one full of curiosity is familiar only in dreams and during those moments when a dog's profile plays in the steam of a kettle. End quote. There goes that dog again, and the madness of teeth bared, limbs unfolding. In the classic definition of bared, the process is not a revelation but an unconcealment, the removal of a covering from something. This is no secret being exposed. This act is making known what is always already there. Think Heidegger here. Think Agamben. Think, too, precarious life of some sort or other. I want to leave Florin's opening statement for other moments in the novel where this attachment to the animal is reiterated and becomes central to the novel's metaphorical landscape. The indigenous character in Mercy and the oldest of the three indentured women on the farm, and there's arguments about whether it's indentured, whether they're indentured servants or whether they're slaves, enslaved peoples, and we can talk about that a little bit if you'd like. And the oldest of the three indentured women on the farm, Lena, quote, had been purchased outright and deliberately. In the only chapter dedicated to her story, Lena worries about the festive mood that overtakes the farm at the building of Jacob Varb's, quote, Barak's, quote, double-storied, fenced and gated house, like the one he saw in his travels, end quote. In true Thomas Sutpen form, Varak sets to making his design come to fruition. Lena notes only, quote, killing trees in that number without asking their permission, of course, his efforts would stir up malfortune, end quote. This is the first indication we get that Lena is different from Sorrow and Florence, the two orphan girls that Varak rescues one at a time. I will return to Lena's relationship with nature in a bit, but I want to remark upon how Morrison positions Lena to literally read the threat that Black freedom poses to the territory and eventually the farm that they all inhabit. Upon meeting the unnamed blacksmith hired to work on the gates to Varak's mansion, Lena recounts, and I quote again, learning from mistress that he was a free man doubled her anxiety. He had rights then, and privileges, like Sir. He could marry, own things, travel, sell his own labor. She should have seen the danger immediately because his arrogance was clear. When mistress returned, rubbing her hands on her apron, he removed his hat once more, then did something Lena had never seen an African do. He looked directly at mistress, lowering his glance, for he was very tall, never blinking those eyes slanted and yellow as a ram's. Again, it is the animal who lets us know the human's condition. Contemplating the blacksmith's relative freedom, Lena tells us, quote, in the town she had been taken to after the conflagration had wiped away her village, that kind of boldness from any African was legitimate cause for a whip. And remember, it's for a whip, not a whipping. So I'm very much interested in the idea of the presence of the whip itself as prohibiting certain behaviors as opposed to the actual act. Right? And there's moments like that in this novel that are bothersome to me, though attractive. It is interesting that we find out about Lena's peoplelessness at the precise moment that she describes punishment for an exercise of free will, or because we are talking about a gaze here, punishment for the face-to-face practice of ethical commitment to the other. Morrison has Lena not only repudiate this commitment in racialized terms, but also states her relationship to such commitment as a kind of homelessness. I would like to argue that this state of dispossession, if possession marks the free, as in the paragraph above, unmakes Lena's relationship to sovereignty. She becomes a character for us in the midst of making her own kinless state while referring to potential punishment for a simple act of practiced belonging, the face-to-face, eye-to-eye of the blacksmith and the mistress. Unlike Florence and the blacksmith, Lena is tortured by the animal. As just a few pages from the scene above, she tells us of the disease that took her family and all the others. Morrison writes, and I quote again, at first they fought off the crows, she and two young boys, but they were no match for the birds or the smell, and when the wolves arrived, all three scrambled as high into a beech tree as they could. They stayed there all night, listening to gnawing, baying, growling, fighting, and worst of all, the quiet of animals, sated at last. In many ways, end quote, in many ways, the novel is about the awful quiet of animals, human and non-human, sated at last. Remaking herself with a bricolage of conquest in the Americas, relying on memory, to quote again, and her own resources, she cobbled together neglected rites, merged Europe medicine with native, scripture with lore, and recalled or invented the hidden meanings of things, found, in other words, a way to be in the world. She called with birds, chatted with plants, spoke to squirrels, sang to the cow, and opened her mouth to rain, end quote. A New World Temple Grandin, she becomes a quintessential American by being dispossessed of the narrative of her past. In her state of relative cultural collapse, she turns to the animal and communicates. Such communication does not signal meaning-making, so much as it signals a becoming animal that serves as a rationale for the novel's treatment of Lena as a medium. And I'm not saying here that pieces of what Morrison is narrativizing didn't happen in some way, shape, or form. I'm interested in how that happening is juxtaposed with all the other characters in the novel and might open up another territory for investigation for us as critics. Whenever we move back in the past, the world becomes thick with non-human animals. Moreover, the unmooring of Lena and her subsequent New World remaking prepares her for the following, at least according to Sorrow, and I quote again, that Lena ruled and decided everything, sir, and mistress did not. Her eye was everywhere, even when she was nowhere, end quote. For Sorrow, Lena is the king of kings, the doer, the decider, as she has the power to take the first, but not the second child of sorrow, and abandon it to float down the waters of a nearby creek. The possibility of becoming sovereign, in that kind of Derridian way, couched in the most restrictive terms, where the beasts around are tamed, and power over life and death is in full exercise. Last section, ethical lessons. I want to travel through the second brief section of the novel under the umbrella term of mercy and think through some of the novel's challenges to what I am thinking of as the ethical commitment. I will start with Jacob's rescue of the raccoon. In many ways, this scene is the first human act of the story, but it also involves an animal and demonstrates the ways in which saving the animal is always at the threshold of rescuing human being, and sometimes from itself. Morrison writes, Jacob urged the mare to a faster pace. He dismounted twice, the second time the breathability hind leg of a young raccoon struck in a tree break. Regina, the horse, munched trailside grass while he tried to be as gentle as possible, avoiding the claws and teeth of the frightened animal. Once he succeeded, the raccoon limped off, perhaps with the mother forced to abandon it, or more likely, into other claws, end quote. Between two animals, the mare and the raccoon, and two iterations of claw, one belonging to the raccoon and the other to an unknown predator, Jacob commits his first act of mercy. It is 1682, and he is traveling via the Lenape Trail on his way to a plantation called Jublio, owned by a man named De Ortega in Maryland. The act of dislodging the injured raccoon is meant to tell us who Jacob Varick is. The work with the animal is meant to steer us into future work with the human. And it does, as his second act, the taking of the girl Florence in exchange for an unpaid debt, appears to be a mercy of signature meaning. Yet we find that all acts of kindness, as in the case of the raccoon, that one could argue is freed for death, are not always ethical acts. If the ethical commitment of the human is to the other, something more than my life, then what is Jacob's face-to-face commitment to Florence, the girl child Florence given to Jacob by the broke plantation owner in Maryland? We learn at the end of the novel that a mercy is this solitary act. All of the others in the novel are just reverberations of the same, like a ripple on a pond. Morrison provides some answer to the conundrum of this second act of mercy in Jacob Varick's attitude toward trading in human cargo. As Jacob notes, flesh was not his commodity. But we are introduced to Jacob's disdain for slave trading, not because of his absolute abhorrence of the thing itself, the trade in flesh, but because of the people with whom he associates such trade. He sees Maryland as a Palatinate state that was Romanish to the core, quote, end quote. I'm quoting here. Priests strode openly in his towns, their temples menaced its squares, their sinister missions cropped up at the edge of native villages. Law, courts, and trade were the exclusive domain of overdressed women in raised heels rode in cars driven by 10-year-old Negroes. He was offended by the lax, flashy cunning of the papists. Jacob is not repulsed by slavery, so much as he is unnerved by Catholicism. There was something beyond Catholic in De Ortega, something sordid and overripe, says Jacob. We have more descriptions of De Ortega and his plantation's inhabitants. A Slavic man, their narrow grasp in the English language, their foolish, incomprehensible talk, and curdled, arrogant fop. It is here that Morrison sets attention in the novel on religious difference, rather than racial difference, and I would also add, in gendered difference. If the opening scene of Varrick's travel south holds open the possibility of his interspecies compassionate practice, the scene between human beings in the first section arrests us. The scene that begins in the first section that arrests us is between Jacob and Florence's mother, the woman we will eventually come to know through her own brief narrative at the novel's close. Morrison writes, and it's a rather long quote, "Please, Senor, not me. Take her. Take my daughter." Jacob looked up at her, away from the child's feet, his mouth still open with laughter, and was struck by the terror in her eyes. His laugh creaking to a close, he shook his head, thinking, God help me if this is not the most wretched business. "Why, yes, of course," De Ortega, shaking off his earlier embarrassment and trying to reestablish his dignity. "I'll sell her to you, immediately." His eyes widened as did his condescending smile, though he still seemed highly agitated. "My answer is firm," said Jacob, thinking, "I've got to get away from this substitute for a man." But thinking also, perhaps Rebecca would welcome a child around the place. This one here, swimming in horrible shoes, appeared to be about the same age as Patricia. And if she got kicked in the head by a mare, the loss would not rock Rebecca so. "There's a priest here," De Ortega went on. "He can bring her to you. I'll have them board a sloop to any port on the coast you desire." "No," I said. "No." Suddenly the woman, smelling of clothes, knelt and closed her eyes. They wrote, "New papers." End quote. But what brings Varrick to this end? I would like to offer that the differences here could all be parsed through the article that moves us forward through acts of mercy throughout the text. Instead of the mercy, where the refers to something known to the listener, we have a mercy, an act more unknown and unspecified. What brings Jacob face to face with the mother about to give up her child is a turning point in the tension between Varrick and De Ortega. Quote again, Jacob raised his eyes to De Ortega, noticing the cowardice of unarmed gentry confronted with a commoner. Out here in the wilderness, dependent upon paid guards nowhere in sight this Sunday, he felt like laughing. Where else could rank tremble before courage? Jacob turned away, letting his exposed, unarmed back convey his scorn. It was a curious moment. Along with his contempt, he felt a wave of exhilaration, potent, steady. And it's at this moment that he sees Florence's mother. Immediately after this, Jacob passes the cookhouse, sees the woman in the doorway, and is offered the child. Like Faulkner's Thomas Suppin again in Absalom, Absalom, his visit to the big house produces an articulation of class difference so profound that it sets him to laughing until he comes face to face with the woman. With the ethical commitment before him, Jacob can be persuaded to take the girl as an afterthought in a series of relations grounded in inequality. He realized, and I'm quoting here, not for the first time, that only things, not bloodlines or character, separated them. End quote. Moreover, class relations here is evidenced by the myriad of references to De Ortega as effete or laced with sexual energy and gendered life. A mercy here is a singular but mysterious act, known only to the interlocutors. In any event, this mercy significant is not reciprocated by Jacob. He does not think of that moment literally in kind or in relationship to Florence's mother, but rather as evidence of his elevated stature in the world. This elevation causes him to have fantasies of building, quote, a house that size on his own property. And again, a house that size on his own property. Later in the same section, we learn that Jacob, quote, did what was necessary, secured a wife, someone to help her, planted, fathered, end quote. I'm going to skip this and go into the next section. So I want you to remember this. This one thing here, swimming in horrible shoes, appeared to be about the same age as patrician. And if she got kicked in the head by a mare, the loss would not rock Rebecca so, end quote. The death of their fifth child has rocked his otherwise capable wife, Rebecca. And so the substitute child, the enslaved, is valued, is exchanged because a loss would not rock her so. Florence figured death by mare 2 times as the first mare, Regina, who has a name though Florence's mother does not, carries Varric to the De Ortega plantation, bringing about her separation from her mother. And the second mare, having already killed the 5-year-old patrician, is conjured here to produce a second value for Florence. The capriciousness of the animal is utilized by Morrison to mark Florence's situation in Jacob's eyes. The proximity to the animal makes her status as chattel even more cogent. The exchange of child for slave child, the end of Varric's bloodline, the presence of the mare produces a sexually potent situation. Remember, it's a horse, it's a mare, not just a horse here. If anyone's ever tried to ride a mare, they know what I'm talking about. A charged scene of sexual possibility is emphasized during De Ortega's tour of, quote, the little sheds on the plantation, ostensibly to have Varric select a slave to settle De Ortega's outrageous debt. As they pass the cookhouse, Jacob sees Florence's mother and says, her, that one, I'll take her. Realizing that the close scent which follows her is also evident in De Ortega's sweat, quote, he suspected that there was more than cooking De Ortega sought to lose. Like an animal, Jacob senses De Ortega's weakness. In these scenes of sexual tension and transgression, we are ever reminded that diversity is also interconnectedness, that we cannot pull apart the racial elements of the novel from their embeddedness in class, that we cannot have our race and class without our sexuality too, that we cannot have our discussion about sovereignty and about freedom without thinking about the animal. As the section closes, we see Jacob remember Regina, his released mare, fondly by remarking upon the night sky, a canvas smooth and dark as Regina's hide, as he washes away, quote, the faint trace of coon's blood, end quote. I cannot help but think about the double meaning of coon here. In the end, his walk in the warm night air, his reflection upon the animal, brings him to the following conclusion, and I quote one more time. Now he fondled the idea of an even more satisfying enterprise, and the plan was as sweet as the sugar on which it was based. And it's at this moment that he changes his mind and starts to really get into the running business. The sexual satisfaction that comes from capital gain is palpable here. Jacob settles upon this plan after a conversation with patrons at Percy's Tavern, but he also settles upon this plan in the wake of another scene with another horse. On his way to his lodging, he saw a man beating a horse to its knees. Before he could open his mouth to shout, rowdy sailors pulled the man away and let him feel his own knees in the mud. Few things angered Jacob more than the brutal handling of domesticated animals. He did not know what the sailors were objecting to, but his own fury was not only because of the pain it inflicted on the horse, but because of the mute, unprotesting surrender glazing its eyes, end quote. Brutal handling of domesticated animals and attempts at domestication, at civilizing, at acculturation, have more in common with animal being than we might think. There are 2 gazes in this opening section, that of Florence's mother, who remarks at the end that she had, quote, gathered you and your brother to stand in their eyes, end quote. One could argue that the only human endeavor that matters is the ethical commitment to the other, who can be seen because of the commitment to more than one's own life. It is clear that Florence's mother sees, recognizes, and inhabits this space called a mercy. It is also clear that Varric's own vision is skewed by the way in which Florence is exchanged for so many things in the beginning of this section, an exchange mediated by the persistent and relentless referencing to the animal. The focus on the human in the novel is consistently interrupted by the gaze of the non-human other, which calls for sharper focus on the doers and the done to, demands a clearer perceptiveness about what freedom and sovereignty mean in the context of this new world order, whose logocentrism necessarily and repeatedly puts human at odds with animal in a kind of relentlessness that we must imagine we need to unpack. Thank you. That's okay. I just wanted to see how long it was. Just curious.
Well, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm wondering about Beloved, because when you think about everything that she does with the animal in A Mercy, I'm wondering if you're interested in the way that she decides in A Mercy, of course, to go back to the 17th century, late 1600s, but in Beloved, then, when she's giving us the 19th century focus, she also gives us that focus on the animal, but it's the same in some ways, but different, right? So I'm wondering if you can think about two parts of Beloved. I'm wondering if it becomes productive to do so. The part when school teacher, of course, you know, tells the children to line up the human and animal characteristics, and then
make sure you line them up.
Right, and to make sure you line them up. And then, of course, that other part when Paul D tells Setha, you know, you have 2 feet, not 4. Right, so I'm wondering, and the reason why, just to say a little bit more, the reason why I'm thinking about it not only in terms of what she's doing with animals and both, but I guess like everybody, I'm still trying to figure out what in the world she means when she tells us that A Mercy is about that pre-race moment. Because that's possibly really much more complicated than what we're trying to talk about here. Yeah. So yeah, whatever you want to do with it.
And that's what, you know, well, I feel like I can start with the second part first, because I feel like that's why I'm interested in the characterization of Lena. In order to signal, right, this kind of pre-race moment, you know, she invents a native character, right? And I'm interested in how Lena is deployed as in the book as a figure of that moment.
Now, after carefully listening to what the professor has said, Dr. Sharon Harland is indeed a professor, and she's a black one. Of course, she has to know something about black history. You know, whatever she's saying is true. In as much as by the beginning of before the introduction to the history, she said that she's majorly speaking on speculation, and we know the opposite of speculation is facts. However, can everyone be saying the same speculation? Because not everyone will always be right, and also not everyone will always be wrong. Somehow, we find that there is some similarities with what she's saying and what other black professors like Dr. gThe says in her books, you know. Here is something that I want us to know about America, the black people, and the Indians. Now, the history of the black people in America before the institution of slavery is a multifaceted story of migration, exploration, and interaction with the continent's indigenous people. While the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement of Africans are often the focal points of discussion about the African presence in the Americas, the story of black people arrival and settlement before the establishment of the slave trade is complex, rich, and spans several centuries. To understand this history, we may have to look at these key points. The first one is the pre-Columbian interaction. Early European exploration and the beginning of African arrivals. Before Columbus came, during European exploration and the beginning of African arrivals, and the gradual formation of a distinct African diasporic presence. The first one I want us to look at is the pre-Columbian and African exploration of the Americas. Long before the arrival of Christopher Columbus, there were ancient African seafaring civilizations with the technology and the knowledge capable of crossing vast oceans. The possibility of African explorers reaching the Americas before Europeans is an area of growing academic interest, although historical evidence remains debated. There are various theories and hypotheses about African presence in the Americas before. One of the most discussed is the potential visitation by the ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, and other Mediterranean seafaring people who may have ventured across the Atlantic. Some scholars have pointed to evidence such as alleged African-like features in some indigenous cultures, similarities in architecture, and the cultural artifacts that may hint at an African content. However, these ideas remain speculative with no definitive archaeological evidence to support them. Another notable historical account is the claim of the Malian Empire, one of the West Africa's most powerful and prosperous empires, may have had transatlantic expeditions. According to some interpretations of the famous accounts of the Mali Emperor, Mansa Musa was the richest man who ever lived. Pilgrimage he was having to Mecca, his fleet reportedly reached the Americas, although these claims lack of concrete proof. This man on his pilgrimage to Mecca was throwing gold like dust. He was throwing gold along the way on his pilgrimage from Mali to Mecca. He was rich. In the absence of solid archaeological evidence, the story of African exploration of the Americas before Columbus remains a matter of ongoing research, with some scholars arguing that it is an underexplored aspect of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact. The second trend we need to discuss is the early European exploration and the first African arrival. The arrival of the black people on the American continent prior to widespread establishment of slavery was inextricably linked to European exploration in the late 15th and early 16th century. As early as the 15th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish were expanding their maritime exploration along the African coasts, and in the process, they encountered and interacted with African people. The first people we had were the Portuguese and the Canary Islands. The Canary Islands is just north of Morocco. Small islands, you know. Now, the Portuguese were among the first Europeans to establish a sustainable, or rather a sustained presence in West Africa, beginning their voyages down the African coast in early 1400s. They were primarily interested in establishing trade routes and extracting wealth from Africa's gold, ivory, and spices. However, the Portuguese also began engaging in slave trade earlier on. The Canary Islands, located just off the northwest coast of Africa, were a crucial stopping point for Portuguese sailors. The Portuguese began importing African laborers to the islands as early as the 1400s to work on plantations, and this practice served as a precursor to the later system of African enslavement in the New World. Now, the Spanish and the Caribbean. In the late 15th century, the Spanish under Christopher Columbus initiated their voyages across the Atlantic. Columbus' first voyage in 1492 opened up the Caribbean islands to European exploration and colonization. It is well known that Columbus' crew included African men, including a Moorish navigator named Pedro Alonso Nino. African sailors, likely from the Liberian Peninsula, which had been under Muslim rule for centuries, were inexperienced seafarers, and they have played key roles in the success of these early voyages. As the Spanish expanded their colonies in the Caribbean, they made early use of African labor, initially in a limited capacity. One of the first recorded instances of Africans coming to the Americans during the period was in 1501, when King Ferdinand of Spain granted the Spanish enslaved, when the King of Spain, whose name was Ferdinand, granted the Spanish settlers in Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic permission to import enslaved Africans. These early arrivals were not yet part of the formal transatlantic slave trade, but they nonetheless marked the beginning of African presence in the Americas. Now we have the case of the African explorers. There is also evidence that African explorers, they themselves, may have been involved in early exploration of the Americas. One of the most famous African explorers associated with the Americas is the Moroccan-born navigator Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. While he lived much later in the 18th century, his story sheds light on the presence of Africans within European exploration circles. However, in the earliest periods of European exploration, many Africans aboard European ships may have been sailors, guides, and interpreters who had been freed or captured. These individuals would have had the knowledge of the sea and navigation, making them indispensable in the early transatlantic voyages. The third one is Africans in early colonial North America. You understand? Now, in the early 17th century, the first enslaved Africans arrived in North America. However, before the establishment of the chattel slavery, in the status of Africans in the English colonies was often fluid. Many Africans who arrived in the Americas in this early period were not initially enslaved. Some were free people, indentured servants, or military personnel who had been captured in Africa or other parts of the world. The first documented African arrival in English-speaking North America was in 1619, when a group of 20 Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia, aboard a Dutch ship. These Africans were originally traded as indentured servants, meaning they were legally bound to work for a period of usually around 7 years, in exchange for passage to the New World. This status was not permanent, and some of the early African indentured servants went on to own land and prosper. In fact, the early 17th century saw a significant degree of racial and legal fluidity. Africans in the early African colonies, or rather early English colonies, could occasionally own property, and some even became free landowners. However, this would soon change as the colonies solidified their economic systems based on race-based slavery. As the 17th century progressed, the early demand for the growing colonial economy, particularly in the tobacco and sugar industries, led to the increased importation of enslaved Africans. The demand for labor in these industries, combined with the decline of indigenous population due to disease and warfare, made slavery a more attractive option for the European colonizers. Gradually, black people in the colonies were increasingly subjected to chattel slavery, a system that will dominate the American landscape for the next 250 years. As the 17th century progressed, the labor for demand of the growing colonial economy, particularly in the tobacco and sugar industries, it led to the increased importation of enslaved Africans. The demand for labor in these industries, combined with the decline of the indigenous population due to disease and warfare, made slavery a more attractive option for the European colonizer. Gradually, black people in the colonies were increasingly subjected to chattel slavery, a system that would dominate USA in the next 250 years. Fourth one, other African presence in early America, exploration, trade, and diplomacy. Now, beyond the English colonies, African people were also present in various parts of the Americas in the early 16th and 17th century. In Brazil, for example, the Portuguese had been establishing sugar plantations as early as the 1500s, importing Africans as slaves to work on the fields. The history of African people in Brazil predates the arrival for the first enslaved Africans in English North America and is an important part of the early African diaspora. Similarly, in Mexico and other parts of Spanish-controlled America, Africans were sometimes brought in as part of the colonial expansions. These Africans were not always enslaved. Some had been brought over as soldiers, captives, or free men. Though the transatlantic slave trade soon supplanted those other forms of migration, African people were also involved in the exploration of the Americas. For instance, some Africans participated in the Spanish exploration of the Americas as soldiers or servants to these people who were conquerors, helping to establish a Spanish territory, or rather authority, in the New World. It's true Africans were part of this, you know. Africans went and traveled even before the slavery. And I surely believe this happened. You understand? Now, the history of black people in America before the formation or formalization of slavery is a complex narrative of migration, exploration, and gradual involvement in the creation of colonial order. This is the fourth part. other African presence in early America, exploration, trade, and diplomacy. Beyond the English colonies, African people were also present in various parts of the Americas in the early 16th and 17th centuries. In Brazil, for instance, the Portuguese had been establishing sugar plantations as early as 1500s, importing Africans as slaves to work on those fields. The history of African people in Brazil predates the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in English North America and is an important part of the early African diaspora. You see, in Brazil, we have the bigger majority is black people in Brazil. We have so many people in Brazil, if not the highest, but we have so many of them. Similarly, in Mexico and other parts of the Spanish-controlled America, Africans were sometimes brought in as part of the colonial expansion. These Africans were not always enslaved. Some had been brought over as soldiers, craftsmen, or free men through the transatlantic slave trade, which soon supplanted those other forms of migration. African people were also involved in the exploration of the Americas, and here is why. Some Africans participated in the Spanish exploration of the Americas as soldiers or servants to these conquerors of lands, helping to establish a Spanish authority in these new worlds. The new world, I mean the North America and South America. They are not new world. The new world thing has been invented by the white supremacist to make himself somebody. You can never discover something or land with people inside. Are those people blind? Don't they see they exist somewhere? All this history was just written by someone who was very, very egoistic and a narcissistic person. The history of black people in America before the formalization of slavery is a complex narrative of migration, exploration, and gradual involvement in the creation of the colonial order. While slavery would become the dominant system shaping the relationship between Africans and Europeans in the Americas, the first African presence in the Americas occurred through a mixture of free individuals, indentured servants, and explorers. From the speculative accounts of African explorers predating Columbus to the early voyages by Africans alongside Spanish and Portuguese explorers to the beginning of African labor in the Caribbean and English colonies, black people had a presence in the America well before the rise of the transatlantic slave trade. Understanding this early history helps challenge the simplification of the African experience in the Americas. It also offers a more nuanced view of the role black people played in the formation of the Americas before slavery became entrenched. And I am adding this. Black people went to the USA, they went to the northern and the southern parts of the USA before slavery. And it has been confirmed well and well again. This is EFK Original Documentaries. If you like what I do, kindly support me on Patreon. I shall surely appreciate. See you in the next one.